Kia ora koutou, good afternoon. I'm Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to the first of a series of shorter form webinars our foundation will be running on how New Zealand can confront its long-term issues despite an increasingly short-term focus in our politics. This series develops from one of the central beliefs informing the work of the foundation, that well-designed public policy is one of the most powerful levers a society has for making change over time. And when we say public policy, that's really a catch-all for the decisions that government makes about the problems that country faces and the rules and spending that follows from those decisions. Public policy covers everything from improving living standards, providing public health care, taxation, borrowing, ensuring a level playing field for business, protecting the environment, responding to natural disasters, etc. And I think many people, myself very much included, have always had the sense that New Zealand has been quite good at designing innovative, effective policy over much of our history, from women's suffrage to universal healthcare to ACC to Farm Act, to the introduction of individual quota in our fisheries management, which is where I started my career, to our network of free trade agreements. New Zealanders have benefited from many well-designed public policies. And perhaps just as importantly, many of those policies have been maintained over multiple decades, multiple changes of government, and those policies have delivered real benefits to our living standards. Yeah, in recent decades, it's been increasingly common to see major public policies change when the government changes, which makes it harder for even the best designed policies to deliver the outcomes New Zealanders expect and deserve, especially on those long-term challenges that face our country in the 2020s, such as responding to climate change, providing for our aging population, improving economic productivity, housing affordability, to name just a few. So this webinar series is an opportunity to have politicians and experts reflect on how New Zealand can design and maintain effective public policy despite the increasingly unpredictable political environment that many democracies, including our own, seem to be experiencing in the 2020s. So we're delighted to have the Honourable Grant Robertson join us today. There are very few New Zealanders who've had the breadth and depth of public policy experience as Grant has had over the course of his career. And likewise, few people who have been faced with balancing the urgent public policy priorities against responding to long-term challenges in the way Grant was during his time in office. So a warm welcome to the webinar to former Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Minister of Sport and Recreation, and now Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago, the Honourable Grant Robertson. It's great to have you here, Grant.
Kia ora Murray, kia ora koutou katoa.
A quick reminder to our viewers today, we're running a shorter webinar format, so we'll try to ensure that there's time at the end for a few questions, but to help us do that, please keep your questions as short as possible. Everyone asking a question today will go in the draw to win one of two signed copies of Grant's recent memoir, Anything Could Happen. Not sure if that resolves, and a couple of copies of our foundation's new book on long-term policy challenges facing New Zealand, Facing Up to Our Future. If you haven't got a copy of either of those books yet, my colleague Ben will be posting links in the chat section. So into the webinar. Grant, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect first on the premise I started this webinar with, that while New Zealand has historically designed effective and enduring public policy, that doing so has become harder in recent years. And if you do agree with that premise, why do you think it's become harder?
Yeah, thanks, Murray. I think overall I do agree with the premise, although there are notable exceptions. And I think, for example, about things like KiwiSaver, which, has obviously endured and had its moments with various politicians tinkering around with it, but, appears to have survived all of that. To some extent, Kiwi Bank as well, although again, politicians potentially looking at the margins to play around with that. I even think in the government that I was part of, the Child Poverty Report and the Child Poverty Reporting Act that Jacinda Ardern sponsored has survived and is, still part of budget reporting and so on. So there are enough examples in more recent times that I think there is still hope. But I do concede, and obviously in my own case, the work that I did around wellbeing, a fair chunk of that's been dismantled by the current government. I think we are in a more partisan era. We are in an era where the half-life of politicians and policies seems to have got shorter. We all know how our world feels more urgent and more busy and more short-term, and I think that has filtered through to policy making in New Zealand as well. So I don't think it's without the possibility of being retrieved. And obviously, the work of the foundation in this area points to that as well. But it's definitely a challenge for any politician at the moment. I'll get it out right now because it's bound to come up in the questions. The 3 year electoral term is a massive barrier to us being able to do that. And even one more year, being a 4 year term, would make a difference to I think, the ability to bed in policy and get some longevity. It's only a part of the answer. It's by no means all of it. But that 3 year cycle combined with just the way the world works today, I think makes it very challenging.
Yeah, well, you've correctly anticipated one of the questions that I was going to put to you, let alone our audience. So no doubt we'll return to that and other, perhaps structural changes that you might like to see in the way political decision making and electoral cycles work in New Zealand. But for now, with a couple of years out of office, I wonder if you could reflect on what you see as the single most significant long-term challenge facing New Zealand over the next 30 years, for the sake of argument, and how you think that challenge should be addressed. What a credible long-term policy response might look like.
Yeah, look, I mean that's sort of like picking your favorite child in a way, isn't it? Like you should never really do it because there are so many significant long-term issues. I'm going to cheat a little bit, Murray, and I'll give you two answers. One which is to answer the question, but one that's probably more about the system. So for me, you can't move past climate change and our response to climate change. It is the existential threat to the planet, to our people, and to, from a public policy point of view, is requires inherently long-term answers that can't be, restrained by one government. And so clearly a lot of work was done over a long period of time, and I want to acknowledge my friend and colleague James Shaw, particularly for the period of time we were in government, as to the work that he did. But obviously, work establishing the Climate Change Commission, creating the reporting arrangements that we did, creating the dedicated funding that we did. This has been forgotten because it got removed, but we did, create what in the trade is called a hypothecation of the funding that we received from the ETS straight back in to emissions reduction and some adaptation work. So I think the basis of what we need to do to deal with climate change was being put in place. It, however, has been dismantled. So for me, that is clearly, an area where we must get cross-party acknowledgement. Again, acknowledging James, that was really the foundation of his work, was his ability to reach out across the aisle and get support for what we were doing, and we did pass that, I think, with the one vote only against the structure and the formation of what we were trying to do. However, public policy, there's a maximum I've always believed in, which is that there's no policy so good that it can't be ruined by bad implementation, and there's no policy so bad that it can't be saved by good implementation. Implementation of these agreed frameworks, these agreed approaches, is what matters. And when you lose the thread of a government who's committed to that, you can still have it in name, but in reality, it isn't playing out. So for me, it's climate change. It's about an agreed set of principles, an agreed framework for responding, and the resources to back that framework. Locking those in is what's needed to resolve, I think, one of the big, not resolve, but address one of the biggest challenges anyone in our lifetimes will face. My secret second answer is more of a framework one, which is I do think there are a set of issues, and you named a few of them earlier on, particularly around issues like climate change, but also I think within child poverty, healthcare, where I think there is a different kind of approach that Parliament could take, which is actually to look at a set of kind of agreed principles for addressing long-term issues, acknowledging that individual policy responses will change over time, but to give some sense of longevity and coherence. And I see that, and this is perhaps a reflection from not being in Parliament anymore. I think Parliament's role, and you could have something like a 75% threshold for changing the principles, something like that, is important here to help shape and guide the executive's response to these big long-term issues. So I feel like there has to be some systematic response to this. I tried a bit of that by legislating the wellbeing framework into the Public Finance Act, and we do that with debt. Debt is specifically named in the Public Finance Act as something that people need to take a prudent approach to. I think we could similarly talk about some other issues like that, but I fear without a parliamentary role, a parliamentary set of agreed principles, the executive won't stick to that. And that's a systemic response to your question as well as a specific one.
Yeah, great. And we might return to again to that. What kind of changes to parliamentary structure would allow those kind of mechanisms that you're talking about, whether there are other examples from comparable democracies where that perhaps works a little better. But for now, and perhaps you've done that with your reference to the climate legislation before. But can I ask you to reflect on what I guess, your personal favorite example of a policy initiative that's addressed a long-term issue in New Zealand might be, and what made that approach successful?
Oh, look, I think KiwiSaver is a great example. I mean, Helen and Michael did just such a remarkable job during that period of time in government, but that ability to look ahead and to find a way to help address New Zealand's really very low savings rate, which has been a major issue for us. Murray, you and I have talked about this before. I do have a theory of New Zealand politics that eventually everything comes back to Rob Muldoon. And classically, of course, there was a superannuation scheme that the Kirk government had in place. Muldoon was able to project that in a way that was grossly wrong and unfair. And if that compulsory super fund had continued on, I think when I was in government, we used to be told it would be worth sort of $300 billion or some crazy number like that. The absence of that had really, really hurt New Zealand. Michael came along with KiwiSaver, classic public policy development. He had a very clear-eyed view of what he was trying to achieve, which you need if you're going to make, long-lasting change. He worked very closely with the financial services sector to help develop that. He worked closely with community groups. He looked at all the ways that you could do that. You needed incentives. You needed things that help lock in that program. And I just think having that clarity of vision, having the right partners involved at an early stage, and then getting it running so that it was hard to undo. In the moment, those incentives just meant that people poured into the scheme. And I remember Michael himself, being, rest his soul, being quite surprised at how successful KiwiSaver became quite quickly. It then became very, very challenging for any government to unravel it. So yeah, I think it's a great example, and certainly my time of being an advisor during that period, and then going forward. Again, not without the danger of tinkering and undermining of it, but ultimately still an incredibly important piece of work.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean it's remarkable that New Zealand, made its way into the 21st century without a compulsory form of retirement savings. And to hear those numbers about what might have been had we got going on that a few decades ago is a little difficult to hear. I wonder if we could spend a bit more time. Oh, and a note to our viewers today. I think many of you have already figured it out, but please put your questions for Grant in the Q&A. And as I said at the start, please do keep those as short as possible. And we'll try to put as many of those to Grant in about 5 or 10 minutes time. But I've got a couple more questions for you. Well, I wonder, Grant, if you could reflect a bit more about the structural, institutional, political barriers to developing policy, with a horizon beyond the electoral cycle. You've talked a little bit about parliamentary mechanisms, and perhaps you could go into a little bit more detail about what they might look like, and perhaps so you sometimes hear proposals about empowered select committees, for instance, and what they might do. But also to the extent you think our electoral system MMP plays a role here, and to the extent you think there might be a role for independent institutions, commissioners, and
Yeah.
perhaps even civil society, the role that can play in sustaining long-term policy settings.
Yeah, a lot in that question, Murray. So just to pick a few things out. The first thing I'd say, obviously, is I think the electoral cycle is a problem. I don't personally believe that MMP is the issue here. How governments manage MMP, what expectations are created around them, I think can lead to some challenges to long-term policy making. But actually, there are other countries in the world with proportional representation systems who do a better job of this. Um, I do think one of the answers is legislative. And so, as I mentioned before, the Public Finance Act, again, a response to Rob Muldoon, clearly put in their specific commitments that governments needed to be able to show that they'd fulfilled. That's what I tried to do with the wellbeing budget. So I put that wellbeing obligation in there. Now, it has been removed, but I still think there is a legislative issue there. You look at some other jurisdictions, and we looked at this, but and then didn't end up doing it. But in Wales and in Scotland, they both legislated wellbeing separately within a front to create the framework. So I do think there is a legislative component. I think the risk in we've got the Child Poverty Reporting Act, and that was effectively a wellbeing measure, but because that was a piece of legislation Jacinda had drafted in opposition, it was ready to go, so we implemented it, and it continues to exist. I do think something that captures a wider definition of well-being and living standards improvement is really important. So that would be something I would definitely do. I mentioned before, I think a parliamentary principles approach, you could review it at the beginning of each parliament, but you find a set of the core issues and you say, these are the principles that are going to guide our work on this. You hope that that would have a significant enough buy-in that it means it would be able to go past a particular period of government. Having parliamentary select committees that scrutinise that way and look at it at that level would be good too, I think, and I think would be genuinely helpful. There is definitely a place for the kind of Royal Commission, People's Assemblies type role, but you've got to, I have on my shelf the social policy from 1986, the genetic modification one from which I was involved in the early 2000s. How influential were they really? I mean, they brought together some impressive people, and it was an impressive body of work. But I think rather than big one-off hits at that, what you want to do is create a continuous stream of that advice from civil society. And we tried to do that within the wellbeing work and the living standards framework work. We developed our wellbeing budget priorities off the basis of community consultation. So I'd rather see something, rather than big one-off commissions like that, an ongoing method by which we're consulting with the community, we're hearing and understanding where those big long-term issues are at. So that's some of the kind of structural things. I saw someone put in the comments something around the idea of a constitution, a written constitution. I had good debates with Sir Geoffrey about this over the years. The biggest thing for me there has always been, where does Te Tiriti sit? Because it is our foundational, effectively constitutional document. So there's something in that, but I think that's an enormous piece of work. And I think there's some elements of agreement principles that would be in a constitution that you could put through the parliamentary process. But yeah, it's always been something I just felt was very big for New Zealand, and we really weren't in a place with Te Tiriti that I felt comfortable about that. But maybe one day.
All right. So we'll now start going through some of the questions we've got coming in. A great question from Janine Parkinson, which I think you've addressed. So I'll move on to one from Aidan Bright here about lobbying. So do you believe lobbying and transparency of conduct in all facets of parliamentary business at large are a key issue for policy development and maintenance? If so, what do you think we should be doing about it? This is something the Foundation's reflected on before with the report a couple of years ago.
No, I definitely agree we need transparency in lobbying. I mean, New Zealand's a small place, and there isn't the sort of lobbying industry that you see in the United States and larger countries. But that shouldn't be a reason to avoid transparency. We need to know who's seeing who, and I believe that is something that is important. One of the things I always used to say to lobbyists too is, I'm happy to have conversations and have them all the time, all around the community. It's not, you don't need to pay someone a lot of money to actually do that. But I think, obviously people with money can exert more power, and you need to have systems in place to do that, to manage that. I don't know. There's some examples, aren't there, including one or two contemporary ones that maybe cast some shadows over this. But overall, in New Zealand's history, I think we've been okay with the way in which we've managed this. But registers, publications of one of the things we did when we were in government for the first time was publish ministers' diaries. That had never happened before, and I think those sorts of initiatives are important.
Do you think a stand down period might work for cabinet
Yeah,
ministers
that
and
one's a
senior people?
challenge in a small country.
Mm.
Like there's only so many people to do particular kinds of roles and jobs. I think the transparency is important. Stand downs, possibly. I'm going to get myself into an area we really don't want to go in today, but one of the reasons before 1990 you had the so-called gold-plated superannuation fund for MPs was because of the challenge of getting work after you've been a member of parliament. We don't have that. We still have a good superannuation scheme, but it's not what it used to be. So, MPs and what they do afterwards, possibly. I think transparency is the best approach in the first instance.
Great. So a question in from Sharon Callahan on AI. And so with AI predicted to displace particularly entry-level graduate jobs and jobs in general, are universities changing the degrees or content to prepare graduates for employment in an AI world? And why don't, given your new role, perhaps you could answer that question and then perhaps reflect more broadly on where tertiary education is in the 2020s and how you see the challenges facing that sector.
Two different hats today, Murray. So up till now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been talking from a personal perspective. Very important that I say that. But I'm happy to answer this question as the Vice-Chancellor of a university. And look, obviously, all universities around the world are grappling with what AI means for what we teach, how we research, what experience we provide to students. And last year, I had the privilege of visiting a few universities around the world to look at what they were doing with AI. The very short answer is it's so fast moving that everybody is facing a very big challenge here. The really important role at a first principles value point of view from my sense is that our job is to continue to be the critic and conscience of society, to provide our students with the opportunity to be critical users of all technology and critical developers of all technology. And so that's our role, and we need people to be able to understand the impact of AI, the ethics of AI, the bias of AI, the environmental impacts of it, as well as being users of it. I think I'd be failing the students who come to the University of Otago if we weren't making sure they understood and knew how to use AI, but we also have to have them in that critical role as well. So that's a really important basis. Massive questions around what it means for assessment, what it means for the way in which teaching takes place. So we've got here at the university committees working on that. We're piloting various projects. We're trying to support students with getting more consistent information about what they can and can't use AI for. But it's a real work in progress, but obviously it represents one of the big challenges. On your broader question about universities today, and again, with the hat on of being the Vice-Chancellor, I am concerned globally for the way universities are struggling at the moment, the social license question for universities, the things we've seen in the United States where, defunding on political basis. I think institutions like universities that are based on evidence and research and science are needed more than ever today. And so I would hope that that's the position we can get to, but there are big challenges for us. It's not just the responsibility of governments, universities themselves have got to be on the front foot about the value of what we do to society, to the economy, to the environment. And we do amazing things here every single day, and we've got to be out there promoting them. Not going to be talked about much, I suspect, in this election campaign, but I really want New Zealanders to think about the importance of the research we do here. Fundamental changes happening in research at the moment. I've got real concerns about the impact that that's going to have on our ability to perform the roles I mentioned before, the pressure on students, cost of living. So yeah, there are some real issues for the tertiary sector. I think we've got the foundations of a brilliant tertiary system in New Zealand, but it does need to be supported and resourced properly.
Yeah, great. So we've got, I think, the most questions we've ever had on a Helen Clark Foundation webinar. So we'll try and get through a few more in the time we've got remaining. A good one here from Roger Tweedy. of all the issues facing society, the most predictable is around our aging population. How do we get a cross-party process underway? So I wonder if you could reflect on that broadly, perhaps the famous three-legged stool, and the various elements of that, how you thought about New Zealand's aging population during your time in government, because it really is one of those, the archetypal kind of long-term
Yeah.
problem facing this country, facing many of our comparator countries, but
It
certainly.
certainly is, and I think, from my perspective, I guess, in acknowledging the time here, one of the things I think used to be a bit of a red herring in this was the cost of superannuation, and so we ended up thinking that the aging population debate was essentially a debate about what age you should be eligible for superannuation. Yeah, that's a big part of the government's budget and a significant area, but it missed, for example, the health system, where in fact the level of expenditure that will be required with an aging population dwarfs any concern you might have about how much money you're spending on super. So I think that's an indication of the fact that the debate about the aging population needs to be one that's set not just about in that superannuation context, but much more in how we think about society, how we think about the health system, but also trying to be a bit more positive rather than just have a deficit mindset about all the costs of that. Think about the fact that people are living longer and what is it that we can all benefit from in terms of having an older, wise population that we can draw on, what sort of different ways of working, what sort of connections within communities we have. And in the wellbeing budget work, one of the things we did was draw on some work that was then part of the New Zealand Social Survey, which was a question that they used to ask every couple of years, which was, how often do you feel lonely? And what we discovered out of that was that loneliness was an impact not just for older people, but for younger people as well. And so we started looking at some initiatives that we could promote that draw our communities back in together. And you've got social service programs, like super grands and the technology programs and so on. So there's a whole lot of ways in which I think we can look at that as both a positive and the fiscal impact, which is obviously large. So yeah, it absolutely sits as one of those long-term issues where you want a set of principles that you're using and you've got policy prescriptions that hopefully have been worked on. If we go, I heard in a different podcast, Chris Finlayson say, why do we have all these things like retirement commissioners and so on? And I'm a big fan of Chris's and we're good friends. But I do think he's right at one level, but I think there's an answer there is that we need those sorts of commissioner type roles looking in from the outside, really pushing us to have a longer term thing and maybe giving them a tiny bit more teeth to be able to actually push government to do that. And there's a different stream of work about officers of parliament and what roles you might think should be within an officer of parliament framework. So I think there's a real place for somebody also nudging us along on the aging population question.
Well, that's a great segue into a smart question here from Phil Attenborough about the tension between the public service and their ability to deliver on solutions over the long term, versus what's being asked of them by their by the ministers of the day, and I wonder if you could perhaps reflect on that tension. What how whether a public servant, a senior public servant, is able to take a long-term view, or whether they are essentially responsive to the minister that they essentially report to.
Indeed, and obviously we're back to Grant the person now, not Grant the Vice-Chancellor, as we were with the last answer. One of the things when we were in government, Chris Hipkins was the Public Service Minister and shepherded through the new Public Service Act, which did shift us away from the State Sector Act of 1988, a response to Sir Robert Muldoon, to something that was more about an integrated public service. And we put in a lot of initiatives within that act to try to facilitate breaking down the silos of government, getting greater collaboration, making it a lot easier for budgets to be shared across agencies. We then took that with the wellbeing approach, and in the 2022 budget, we introduced the clusters. So this was the idea, for example, in justice, there were 8 agencies. We got them all to sit down and say, what are the priorities in the justice sector across your agencies? And then we funded them across one set of goals. And the kind of carrot for them was that they got 3 years of funding at once rather than 1 year. So there are ways I think that you can think about putting the incentives in place for the public sector. the issue we do have is that because the individual entities within the public sector are incredibly hierarchical, and so you've got this kind of chief executive at the pinnacle, and yes, risk aversion is a massive issue there. Again, I feel like if we had been able to continue to roll out the wellbeing approach that we put in with a collective set of goals for the public sector, albeit broken up perhaps into half a dozen clusters, then there's more of an incentive and you fund over a longer period of time to look at it beyond just the immediate 24-hour news cycle that might bedevil one or two of our chief executives. So, look, I have great admiration for the public service in New Zealand, and when we were in and we said what we wanted to do, they worked their backsides off to help us deliver it. I would like to think that both the Act and then the way that we work with public servants as politicians would enable them to be able to look a bit more to the long term. But I think, it's hard in the 24-hour news cycle environment that we have.
Yeah. So good question in here from Dylan Joffe. What are some actions or policies politicians can do now to ensure the next generation has some say in policies enacted today that the future they will live and work in? You're probably familiar. I think you referenced Wales before. One of the things that they've pioneered is a commissioner for future generations. I don't know if you think that's a workable model here, but how does that concept help inform, or how could it help inform good long-term policy making?
Yeah, that's I mentioned before. So Wales has the Future Generations Act, and the Commission arises out of that. And there were a lot of similarities between that and the wellbeing work. I mean, the philosophy of the wellbeing work was intergenerational wellbeing, and therefore taking the longer term view as the whole premise of today's webinar is. Yes, I do think that's important. Again, personal view, very important to acknowledge this is me speaking personally. I do favour the voting age being lowered to 16. We spent a lot of time talking about that when we were in government, and we reached a point at the end where, we believed that was the direction we should be going in, beginning, I think, with local government and then moving out to central government. That to me seems a logical way of starting to bring that in. But just as we think about the aging population, you've just got to have, as a cross-cutting principle, what is the intergenerational impact of a policy? And if I come back to the Public Finance Act again, because of the timing of when that was created in the late 80s, it had that idea that debt was the big, thing that we needed to worry ourselves about. I think an intergenerational equity lens equally could be a clause in the Public Finance Act, so that is an automatic thing that a government is judged on. It's a no-brainer in some ways, because short-termism needs to be challenged in some form, and at a legislative level we could do that.
We're coming to the end of our time here, but a couple of quick fire questions for you. Any thoughts? I think you touched on it a little bit before, but any thoughts on participatory democracy mechanisms, things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, as an effective way of dealing with at least some of our long-term policy challenges?
There's a place. Got to be careful, though, in my view, about what job you ask people to do. I think, I just think there are limitations on it.
Okay. And let's just briefly think a little bit more. You talked about the 4-year term. Do you see any other structural changes that would need to come with that? We've got a question here pointing to would that require us to have a separately elected upper house, for instance,
Yeah.
or a written constitution that you touched on before?
Look, just to be really clear on that, like I think that the 4-year term is important. I've always felt that the movement to create it needed to come from civil society. And I can actually remember being in a room with the chief executive of Business New Zealand and the president of the Council of Trade Unions and saying to them, you two need to run this campaign together, because politicians will always look self-interested if they're the ones who are doing it. So I do think it's important, but I do think it needs to come from the grassroots up. No, I don't think upper house is required. I think MMP creates the checks and balances that we need. You might have an argument about a threshold of 4% rather than 5%, perhaps. But I don't think a 4-year term would require that with MMP in place.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're coming to the end, but as a self-described cricket tragic, I've got to get your thoughts on whether Bangladesh's victory in Australia this week bodes well for our tour of Australia at the end of the year. Do you think we're on course for our first Test series victory in Australia in what 40 years or something?
I did wonder about myself when I celebrated wildly Bangladesh beating Australia about just where my psyche might be. But yeah, look, it does. I mean, Tom Latham's on track. If he can win a series as Test captain in Australia, he'll be, I think, the only New Zealand captain to have won a Test series in India, Australia, and England. So, ever optimistic about that. The Australian team will need to be a bit better than they've been lately. So yeah, no, thanks for bringing cricket in, Murray. I'm sure the audience will have been delighted about that.
Well, look, thank you very much, Grant, for making the time to speak to us in your wearing two different hats. It's been a very illuminating conversation, and it's prompted a whole lot of discussion in our Q&A. So clearly a lot of interest in this fundamental question facing New Zealand in the 21st century, which is how do we make long-term policy to confront our long-term policies in an increasingly short-term world. I don't think we could have had a better person to start off our webinar series. So thank you very much for making the time for this. Um, Please also, to our audience, please consider registering for our next webinar in this series, where I'll be speaking with economic and finance journalist Liam Dan next Wednesday at 12 p.m. But for now, thank you all very much for joining today's session. A particular thanks to Grant Robertson, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.